Edward VI, Hampton Court Palace, 1553. The boy king was rotting alive, and no one was allowed to say it. Beneath a velvet canopy stitched with golden lions, a corpse still breathed. His chest rose in jerks, like something inside him was resisting death and failing. The air was thick with the smell of spoiled meat and lavender water, mixed to mask what no fragrance could decay. His skin, once pale and noble, now bloomed with black sores and yellow blisters. His lips cracked, leaking blood and saliva, and yet they dressed him in ermine robes. They brushed his hair. They said he would recover. Outside the chamber, guards stood rigid. Inside, servants crossed themselves and whispered prayers. The sound of his breathing wet, gurgling, desperate filled the silence like a curse. He could no longer speak. His last words had come days ago, a rasping plea no one dared to repeat. Now, only the eyes remained, open, fever bright, flickering toward the ceiling like they were watching something descend, watching or waiting. Physicians circled him like vultures, bleeding him again. Again, leeches, tinctures, hot irons. They said it was treatment, but every new remedy brought more pain, more screams, more blood on the pillows. Somewhere in the dark corners of the palace, someone was keeping notes. Someone knew what was happening. Someone wanted it. Because kings do not simply waste away in silence, not at 15, not after centuries of war to place a son on the throne, not without someone pulling the strings. He died that night, violently, eyes open, jaw clenched, blood in his mouth, and before the body cooled, a new power struggle had already begun. This isn't just the death of a child, it's the quiet execution of a dynasty. And what you're about to hear was never meant to be unearthed. The candlelight trembles across silken walls of the nursery chamber, where the newborn is swaddled in lace and velvet. His cry pierces the hush of Hampton Court Palace, tiny, desperate, remarkable. That cry belongs to Edward Tudor, born October 12th, 1537, and it carries an unspoken promise, the survival of a dynasty. Nurses hover, their hands trembling in gloves at the edges of his cradle. They breathe soft prayers into the rose-scented air, but their eyes betray a silent dread. Their whispered warnings form a thread beneath the triumph, a baby unnaturally thin, so pale it seems light passes through him. His skin glows waxen in the torchlight. He fits over a palm, already. He feels more ghost than child. Henry VIII stands apart, regal and resolute, his face carved from ambition. He refuses to let fear creep into his gaze. He watches Edward with the intensity of a man who believes fate demands perfection. Yet, as he steps closer, he recoils, not from malice, but shock, as if the soft body in that cradle bears a secret horror. His breath hitches. He turns away, sealing doubts behind a mask of triumph. Each day that follows becomes ritual. Midwives check his pulse as though he might vanish at any moment. An alabaster bowl cradles his fluids, every drop examined. He is swaddled in linen treated with rosewater and camphor to ward off contamination. Portraits of saints hang near. Icons murmur blessings. Yet the air is thick with anxious energy colored by fear, masked as devotion. When he coughs a sudden rattle, wet and low, the silence inside the chamber breaks. Two nurses exchange looks sharper than daggers. Someone whispers about delicate lungs. Another fears fever, but no one says his name in fear of giving power to his fragility. The whisper spins into rumors are these mere childhood illnesses or early signs of something worse, something secret. At midday, Edward lies under pale daylight, seeping through latticed windows. He does not cry. His breath comes in forced gasps. A nurse runs a palm over his chest. It rises irregularly, as if fighting currents beneath. She closes her eyes to block the vision bleeding into memory. She opens them to continue because fear cannot be allowed in. The room smells of wet linen and disinfectant. But beneath that, a sharp metallic scent drips from tiny cuts along his wrists, little wounds inflicted by overzealous staff testing his strength. As weeks pass, doctors arrive, men in dark robes, pale faces framed by lantern glow. Their voices are solemn, distant. They measure, observe, record. They speak of constitution and temperament, cloaked terms for weakness. One doctor touches Edward's ankle, under his fingertip. The baby jerks, wincing. The doctor's breath catches. He withdraws a gloved hand, as though touching ice. Yet he continues scribbling. The official ledger grows. A ledger that will later become evidence of suffering. Despite their anxiety, they dare not oppose the king's will, so they dress Edward in fine linens, lace edges stiff with starch and scented oils. They place tiny golden threads across his insignia. They parade him before courtiers and ambassadors. The boy lies inert, but for the faint flicker of his eyelids. Courtiers bow. Portraitists paint with stiff brush strokes, capturing not the tremor in his form, but the promise of a ruler. Edward hears none of it. All he knows is the pressure, the hush. Nurses hovering at every breath. A librarian in shadows turns a page nearby, half afraid his rustling will disturb the fragile child. In the stillness, each heartbeat echoes like a hammer's blow somewhere deep inside the chamber walls. He is more sculpture than human, straining to breathe beneath the weight of expectation. Night brings no relief. Lanterns cast long shadows above. Edward's cradle rumbles as attendants shift his position. He cries out sharp and sudden. A nurse claps a linen cloth over his mouth. But the cry escapes. It cuts through silence and splinters it. Her eyes go wide and then blank because she is forced to smile when the king asks if Edward is well. She nods, lies, because the monarch cannot be presented with fear. The tension thickens with each hour. Gentle rocking of the cradle, the faint pant of exhaustion, lips stained with drool and powdered herbs, tiny hands curled like claws, and always that pale stillness behind his lashes and uncanny awareness of death hovering just beyond. Edward is born to save a dynasty, but from his first breath, there is something darker at work, whispers of frailty turning into fear, doctors uncertain what cures, yet certain his body is failing, courtiers who smile but step lightly, parents who celebrate but glance sideways. The golden cradle becomes a stage for hope and for tragedy in the wings. And in the hush of those earliest nights, when every rustle is heard, every footstep echoing, something else finds its way into the chamber, a secret poised to swallow the promise whole. The boy was not allowed to breathe the same air as other children. Inside Hampton Court, Edward's chambers became a world unto themselves, silent, scented, sacred. Walls lined with heavy drapery muffled the sounds of the outer palace. No footsteps, no laughter, no wind. Only the hush of starched gowns and whispered orders. Every morning, attendants unlatched the shutters, not to let in sunlight, but to filter it through gauze soaked in rosewater. The light that touched Edward's face was thin, altered, as though reality itself had to be softened for him. The scent of lilies and vinegar lingered in the room, mingled with the faint acidity of bile and iron. The boy coughed, and 4 people leaned in. A single spasm from his lungs could summon a storm. They said he was precious. They said he was divine, but they handled him like porcelain on the edge of a table admired, fragile, doomed to fall. Edward, aged 5, rarely walked. He was carried by gloves, always gloves between velvet cushions and silk chairs. When he spoke, it was in the voice of someone trying not to disturb a god. He was not raised like a prince. He was maintained, preserved, like a relic behind glass. No one told him he was ill, but he saw it on their faces, the way they bowed too long, the way they flinched at his coughs, the way the food tasted of metal and herbs, never salt or warmth, chicken boiled to gruel, milk tested in triplicate. The nurse who once fed him straight from a cup was dismissed within an hour, no explanation, no return. He felt it most at night, the stillness, the strange quiet of a room too protected to be real. He would lie awake, eyes tracing the canopy above his bed, embroidered with Tudor roses, saints, and lions. But what he remembered most was not the gold thread, but the silence, that thick, eerie silence that meant something could be wrong, and no one would say it. He dreamt of gardens, of mud, of loud, laughing boys running past hedges and fountains, dreams he could not name, only feel. His lessons were given in whispers. A procession of tutors came and went, each bowing lower than the last, Latin, scripture, statecraft all spoken through a veil of caution. One day, as he recited from the Book of Psalms, he paused mid-verse, a nosebleed, thick, sudden. It smeared across the parchment, turning the word into something unclean. No one moved at first. Then panic. Rags appeared, curtains were closed. The tutor knelt, hands trembling, as if God himself had been offended. Edward was taken from the room. Later, alone, he asked the nurse why everyone seemed afraid of his blood. She told him not to worry, and then she wept, silently. As she combed his hair, the king visited rarely. When he did, the room changed. A strange theater emerged, curtains drawn wider, attendants rigid. Edward propped upright like a marionette. Henry VIII would enter, broad-shouldered, trailing incense and thunder. His boots echoed across the tiled floor, his gaze quick, sharp, assessing. He would touch Edward's cheek, just once, then nod. He looked strong. He would say, no one dared correct him. The moment he left, Edward would collapse into the mattress, too weak to sit. But the illusion had been preserved, and in this palace, illusion was sacred. One winter, a fever came. It arrived in the breath of a chambermaid who sneezed into her palm before touching the boy's water basin. She vanished that same night. Edward's skin turned slick with sweat, and his lips cracked open like broken porcelain. He moaned not loud, just enough to haunt the corners of the room. The doctors came with their boxes. They whispered in Latin. They drew out needles, a vial of crushed pearls, a decoction of burnt rosemary and powdered coral. Drops of something bitter dripped onto his tongue, and he retched. They told him to be still, that it would help. But his legs trembled, his eyes rolled back. The linen sheets soaked through with something yellow. A priest was called, but never allowed inside. The fever broke 5 days later, but Edward was never quite the same. From then on, the guards at his door stood closer. Nurses spoke less. Every corner of his world tightened. He began to realize something children should not, that he was being prepared, but not protected, that his body was less a boy's, and more a vessel, a throne in waiting, a symbol under siege. One day, he asked a physician if he would be allowed to ride a horse like the men outside. The man smiled, lips pressed thin. "You are a king," he said, "not a soldier." But Edward didn't believe him, because he had never heard a soldier weep behind a closed door. But he had heard a king do it just once when he thought his son was asleep. It began with the shaking. Small. At first, a tremor in the fingers, a twitch in the leg. Edward tried to hide it. He clasped his hands tightly during council sessions, pressed his thighs together under the table, willed stillness into his limbs like a prayer. But still, his body betrayed him. The physicians returned. They no longer knocked before entering. Their hands smelled of vinegar and burnt cloth. They did not speak to him like a boy. They spoke around him notes, pulses, stools, bleeding cycles. Edward sat upright in his ornate chair, back against the tapestry of his lineage, while they measured the failing machine that carried the crown. His breath had changed. It came in shallower intervals, like air through damp straw, at night. The coughing fits left blood on his sheets, on his sleeves, on the pages of his psalter. The priests suggested more prayer. The doctors prescribed blisters. They brought the iron, red hot, glowing, pressed against skin until it blistered, force the body, they said, to draw out the sickness. Edward bit his tongue to keep from screaming. When he did cry out, the servants flinched, and one of them, just one, lowered her head and whispered, "Forgive us." But he never asked them to stop. To be king was to endure. The mercury came next, silver poison, offered as salvation. They mixed it into a paste, rubbed it along his gums, fed it to him in drops, watched as his lips cracked and his teeth loosened in their sockets. He could no longer smile, not because he forgot how, but because the muscles wouldn't obey. Then the pearls powdered to dust, swallowed with honey, to strengthen the blood, they said. He vomited them in silence. Somewhere between these rituals of pain, Edward began to see things that weren't there, shadows curling at the edge of his vision, figures in corners that vanished when he turned his head. He spoke to them, once, and frightened the nurse so badly she refused to enter the room again. Still, they called it healing. His skin took on a gray sheen. The tips of his fingers darkened, as if frost had touched them. Wounds no longer closed. Bandages were replaced twice daily, each time soaked with more than the last. And yet, outside the palace walls, London was alive. Bells rang, sermons thundered from pulpits, ambassadors dined by candlelight. None were told what was happening inside the boy's chamber. They were told the king was recovering, that he merely needed rest, that he was not to be disturbed. His bed was raised, his body propped upright. Royal painters summoned to capture his likeness. They were told not to paint the lesions, not to include the shadows beneath his eyes. Paint strength, one minister said. Paint future. Edward tried to hold the pose. His arm trembled beneath the weight of his scepter. The painter's hand shook too, and in that silent moment, brush against canvas. Two truths met without a word. One could not bear to record the truth, and the other no longer had the strength to demand it. The smell grew worse. No rosewater could hide it. Decay has its own language, bitter, wet, sickly sweet. It clung to the curtains, seeped into the wood, crept under the door. Those who stayed too long near the king left with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. Some refused to return. The court whispered, was it consumption? A wasting disease? Poison God's judgment. They dared not ask out loud. The silence around Edward's condition became sacred, a pact of denial upheld by everyone who feared what truth would demand of them. He was 15, but in the mirror, a stranger stared back, hollowed cheeks, blackened nails, eyes rimmed with red. He once asked a servant to describe the sunrise. She opened her mouth, but the words died on her tongue. He hadn't seen it in weeks. One evening, as the sky outside faded to slate, Edward sat upright and asked for a book. His hand trembled as he opened it. He stared at the words familiar, once beloved, but they no longer meant anything. Letters floated, lines blurred. The pain in his chest rose like floodwater. He let the book fall. He did not cry. Kings were not taught how. A physician entered then, carrying a new tincture, thicker than the last, red as rust. He knelt beside Edward's bed, holding it like a chalice. Edward looked at him, not with fear, but with something colder, resignation. The boy opened his mouth, drank, swallowed, and the pain began again. The crown no longer fit. His head, once round and princely, had thinned beneath the skin. Bones pressed outward, eyes sank deeper. The royal circlet, reshaped to rest on a skull, had to be padded inside, with cloth to keep it from slipping. And yet they made him wear it. By morning light, servants entered his chambers like actors to a stage. Curtains were drawn back with practiced flair. Fresh linens, stiff with starch and soaked in perfume, were laid over his mattress. He was lifted gently, placed upright, dusted with powder to hide the bluish pallor creeping up his neck. Rouge was dabbed onto his cheeks, trembling hands trying to mimic the glow of youth. His fingers cold, rigid, were curled around the orb and scepter. Outside the doors, ambassadors waited. Inside, the boy prepared to meet them, dressed for a throne he could no longer hold. His breath came in shallow pulls, each one an effort. His chest rose in irregular rhythm. His mouth, swollen and cracked, parted only enough to allow whispers. He could no longer eat. He could no longer stand. But they placed him on a throne anyway, surrounded by tapestries and symbols of conquest. A show was required. The world had to see its king. The first time he coughed blood in front of them, there was a silence that no etiquette could cover. The cloth he used, once pristine, now blotched crimson, trembled in his hand. Eyes darted, faces stiffened. The ambassador from Spain bowed deeply and said nothing. The audience was ended early. Later that evening, a meeting was held without Edward. They could not hide it much longer. But they tried. They told London he was ill, but recovering. They issued proclamations of his strength. They sent portraits retouched across Europe. A boy with golden hair, a gaze of determination, cheeks flushed with power, the image of a future secure. Meanwhile, behind the palace doors, Edward vomited blood into silver basins. No one spoke of the ulcers now lining his throat, the swell of his joints, the night terrors that left him gasping. His sleep came in bursts, interrupted by pain too deep to scream through. The sheets had to be changed twice each night, sometimes 3. The stain never quite faded. He could hear them through the doors, men speaking low, arguing in corners, names Mary, Elizabeth, Gray. He didn't understand all of it, he was not told. But he could feel it, the heat of succession, already rising like a fever in the walls. One morning, he asked a servant, "What happens when I die?" She froze, then smiled, soft and rehearsed. "You'll be remembered, Majesty. That's all that matters." He didn't believe her. He looked out the window, his only view of the world. Gray skies, black trees, a winter that hadn't ended. He had not walked outside in months. He had forgotten how wind felt. A letter arrived, from his sister Mary. He asked to read it himself. They hesitated, then handed it over. He held the paper in shaking hands. He read slowly. Her words were gentle, but behind them, he sensed the chill of distance, of inevitability. He signed no reply. The next week, his teeth began to fall out. One by one. No one spoke of it, but the basin beside his bed began to fill with more than blood. They burned his soiled linens behind the stables. Even the servants grew quiet, too quiet. One nurse refused to enter his chamber after midnight. She said she heard something breathing that wasn't the king. The room grew colder. He asked for music once. A small quartet was brought in. They played a hymn, softly, trembling with nerves, as the melody wavered in the air. Edward shut his eyes, not from joy, but from pain. His head tilted. A tear rolled down his cheek. Not for himself, but for what he'd never become. The crown still sat on the table nearby, polished, untouched. He turned away from it and whispered, "Let them have it." Then he slept, and the coughing began again. They found him cold. Not stiff, not peaceful, just cold, eyes open. As if mid-thought, lips parted, one hand clenched in the folds of the bedsheet, the other hanging limp over the side. A final drop of blood clung to his bottom lip, already dry. The physician who stepped forward didn't speak. He only bowed, deep, deliberate. When he rose, his face was ash. Behind him, a minister dropped to his knees. The silence that followed was unnatural. It pressed against the walls, thick and unbroken, as if the room itself refused to acknowledge what had happened. The boy who had been their king, the heir, the hope, the fragile miracle was gone. The windows were covered. The door was bolted shut. Word could not yet escape. But word never waits. Down the corridors of Whitehall and Hampton, across tapestried halls and behind guarded doors, the truth began to seep like the scent of rot no rosewater could bury. Edward VI was dead. The boy king had not saved the dynasty. He had ended it. By nightfall, the gloves were off. Counselors emerged from side chambers, pale and calculating. Maps were drawn from drawers, seals pressed into wax, letters sent on black horses toward the north, toward the Tower, toward Norfolk. One name echoed louder than the rest. Mary, Henry's eldest, his Catholic daughter, disowned once, now a threat reborn. But Northumberland Duke, schemer, shadow behind the throne, had already moved. He did not weep at Edward's death. He acted in the dead king's final weeks. Northumberland had pressed ink onto the boy's trembling hands, a document, a devise, a will that named Lady Jane Grey, Northumberland's daughter-in-law, as heir to the English crown. Jane, young, Protestant, educated, obedient, and terrified. She had no claim, not by blood, not by law, but she had one thing that mattered more. She had the backing of a man who now held the keys to every gate in England. 10 days after Edward's death, she was summoned to the Tower, dressed in white, crowned with trembling hands, declared queen. Trumpets sounded, bells rang. Her face was pale as the parchment bearing her name. And still no one dared speak aloud, but they all knew this would not last. Because Mary was coming. From Norfolk, her banners rose. Men gathered, farmers, knights, veterans of her mother's court. They marched not for love of her politics, but for blood, for legitimacy, for the memory of a queen cast aside and a daughter denied. London grew nervous, eyes shifted in prayer, swords were counted in secret. Inside the tower, Jane walked the cold corridors, not as monarch, but as prisoner in waiting. She read scriptures to calm her shaking hands. She asked her husband if he thought they'd survive. He said nothing. By the 9th day, Mary's army stood at the gates. The council broke, lords fled. Northumberland, once bold, was now a ghost in chainmail. His eyes darted like a fox in a snare. He was dragged from his horse, his titles stripped, his fate sealed. Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, was told to remove her crown. She did not resist. She lowered it herself, hands steady. Then she was led away. And Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, sister to the dead king, walked into Westminster with tears in her eyes and vengeance in her chest. London cheered, but not without fear, for they remembered her mother's pain. They remembered her exile, and they knew such memories do not fade. They harden. The throne was hers now, and she would not forget who tried to steal it. That winter, bonfires burned high, but the warmth did not reach the palace walls. Inside, the rooms where Edward once coughed himself to sleep were emptied, tapestries removed, bedding destroyed. No portrait of him remained. No ceremony honored his burial. He was lowered into the earth beneath Westminster Abbey, beneath torchlight, not trumpet. His body, once painted as divine, now wrapped in linen and silence. No monument was raised, but in the minds of those who survived that year, his image remained pale, thin, wasted, still gripping the weight of a crown that had crushed him long before death did. And over England, a new shadow fell. Not the silence of mourning, but the drumbeat of reckoning. The years passed, and with them, the memory of Edward VI faded from portraits, from courtly prayer, from the tongues of those who once bowed low in his presence. But not entirely, because silence does not mean absence, and absence does not mean peace. Beneath the stone vaults of Westminster, where his body lies interred without monument, where even his epitaph fades under the dust of newer kings, there remains a stillness not of honor, but of abandonment. He died in pain, that much is known. But only centuries later did the truth begin to whisper back. In a dimly lit archive in Cambridge, behind glass older than any living memory, a leather folio lies open. The ink has browned, the margins bleed. Notes never meant for public eyes stare back like wounds still raw. A physician's log. Spring. 1553. His Latin falters. His lines tremble. He writes of blackened fingernails, of teeth that drop out in sleep, of breath that carries the heat of death before it arrives. He does not theorize. He does not warn. He only observes. And beneath the notes, a single word, venom poison. Next to it, a slash of the pen, no conclusion. A different page, a letter. Unsigned, the handwriting that of a woman, thin and angular. She speaks of the boy who does not blink, of linens that smell not of sickness, but of something old, already past. She describes the flicker of candles and the way Edward's shadow seemed to shrink nightly, like time devouring him before death could. And yet, the court went on. The ministers prayed, the artists painted, the people watched the windows of Whitehall for signs of life, never knowing the life inside had already fled. Today, the historians gather the fragments like bones. Some speak clinically tuberculosis, perhaps. Others blame the medicine mercury rubs, blistering irons, leech therapy. But among them are those who go silent not out of ignorance, but reverence. Because what happened in those final weeks wasn't merely a medical tragedy. It was a ritual, a performance of care, a choreography of denial, a boy consumed not just by illness, but by expectation, by silence. The tragedy of Edward VI is not how he died. It is how he was used. He was not a monarch, he was a symbol, a placeholder, a promise inked in gold that the body beneath could never sustain. And when he failed, they did not mourn him. They replaced him, quietly, efficiently. Mary took the throne, the fires were lit. Elizabeth watched from the shadows, waiting. But the boy was buried without ceremony, without monument. his death marked only by the political machinery it set in motion. A child, offered to a kingdom like a coin at the altar. And yet, something remains. In the archives, under layers of dust, notes written by hands long gone still bear witness. In the chapel where he was laid, visitors speak of an inexplicable weight of breath that shortens, of rooms colder than the stone should allow. In the east corridor of Hampton Court, staff say the scent of lavender lingers, always strongest near the window where Edward once sat. Not every ghost wails. Some simply wait, and some still search. In a stone basement beneath Oxford's Bodleian Library, a young researcher holds a brittle letter sealed in wax unbroken for nearly 500 years. Her gloves tremble slightly, the pages stained, the ink faded to a shade between rust and shadow. The signature is missing, but the words are unmistakably real. They speak of the king, not with reverence, with fear. They do not know what they are doing to him. The letter reads, "They speak in tones of prayer, but their hands shake. One applied salve with the wrong root. He meant no harm, but the boy wept blood." She reads it again, slower, letting the silence grow. The room around her fades, and for a moment she sees it not with the eyes of a historian, but of a witness. The flicker of tallow light, the rasp of shallow breath, the cold stone underfoot, and the scent not of books, but of antiseptic, of ash, of lavender rotting in its own sweetness. In that moment, the centuries collapse. She does not cry. She writes, later, her work will be published, peer-reviewed, catalogued, but nothing on the page will capture the chill she felt in her spine. Because Edward VI is not just a figure to be studied. He is a warning carved in flesh, a question left unanswered. What happens to a soul when a crown is placed on it too soon? What does a country bury? When it buries a child, it cannot afford to mourn. And so, he waits, in history's blind spot, beneath the weight of silence polished to marble. Still watching. Still cold. Still crowned. No anthem played. No flags were lowered. Edward VI was laid to rest beneath the abbey floor in silence, wrapped not in velvet, but in linen hardened by death. There was no golden bier, no royal procession echoing down the nave, only the scrape of stone, the brief murmur of Latin, and the heavy footsteps of men who no longer needed a boy to rule in their name. He had died in July. By August, Mary sat on the throne, and by winter, the country had already turned its face away. The boy once heralded as the savior of a dynasty was buried without monument, without music, without memory. His coffin was lowered into the crypt beside greater names, but his name was already growing fainter. A king without legacy, a child erased. But the stone remembers, and the shadows. One slab in Westminster lies colder than the rest. Most visitors pass it without a glance. The inscription is faded, illegible. The guides seldom pause. They speak of Elizabeth, of Henry, of Mary. But Edward is an echo. And yet, on certain nights, beneath the vast hush of the cathedral dome, something lingers, a shape, a stillness, a boy seated where no boy should be, pale hands folded, eyes fixed, not on the altar, but on the door, waiting, not for resurrection, but to be seen. In an age that demanded kings, he was given a crown made of silence.
Not for resurrection,
he ruled nothing,
but to be seen.
He conquered no one.
In an
His
age
reign
that
began
demanded
in hope
kings,
and ended
he was
in
given a
hospital
crown
bed
made of
soaked
silence.
with blood and prayer.
He ruled
They
nothing.
said he died a king.
He conquered no one.
But in truth, he was buried a secret. And sometimes, when the wind turns through the abbey gates just so, you might hear it not a voice, not a hymn, but breath. Breath that should have been a life. Breath that once tried to carry a kingdom and was never heard again.